and we love when the listeners share our content. Today, we are teaching on the psyche, and that's really exciting, not to be confused with the two words. We'll go around and introduce ourselves real quick. If you're new to the program, my name is Jake Wiskerson, and I'm a marriage and family therapist in Northern Nevada, licensed by the state of Nevada to do outpatient talk therapy. And then we have DB Palmer up in Oregon. DB, introduce yourself if you would.
Hey, I'm DB Palmer. And,
Good job. Let's move on.
Exactly. Moving on. Like we're introing ourselves now. Yeah, licensed in a few states, 6 or 7 or 10. Working on 10, just because it seems like a fun round number. Licensed in a few states as a psychotherapist. And let's see. Next up is Brandon.
Yep, Brandon Covey here, licensed professional counselor in the state of Ohio.
Michael Sedini. I'm a Libra. I started Walk the Talk America. I love that we're doing introductions now. Jake's throwing curveballs.
I want to keep you guys sharp. It's 8 a.m. on the Pacific time zone, so we gotta wake ourselves up, get all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
He only throws Jake's throwing for a little while, so I guess maybe he's got to get some reps in.
Inside joke there is that I've been playing a Sunday League adult ball for like a long time, baseball, and I didn't play last year because the schedule was pretty tough. But I've been on this team called the Expos for the last several years, probably since 2018, I want to say, and I got a text message from the manager. I was all excited. I'm going to commit to the season, but I can only do a game here or there. But I was committed. I was going to start working out and practicing and stuff. And my kids are of the age now that they can truly appreciate dad playing hardball. And I get a text. He's like, "Hey man, it's tough to have these conversations, but we got 19 guys on the roster who are fully committed, and I really need to be able to play them all. If they show up, you're not going to have space. Probably best if you don't show up to practice on Saturday." So I got designated for assignment in a Sunday league rec team. But as much as that hurts my ego, I know that there's something deeper than my ego, which is called my true self, and I'll get into that in a minute. So yes, I will be throwing curveballs, even if it's to 8-year-olds in Little League, because I'm also coaching. Normally with us is Eddie Davenport. Eddie Davenport's a clinical social work associate, meaning he's still supervised to do his work, operating under somebody else's license. He's in North Carolina, but he's away at a competitive shooting match. He does black powder competitions, the old school rifles made new today. And so he's down in Georgia doing one of those. So normally Eddie's with us. And then we have the illustrious, stupefying Kevin Berry.
Hi, I'm an Aquarius. Just thankful to be here. Not really licensed in anything. I have some random marketing certifications, but that's it.
It's the dawning of the age of Aquarius. So, well, thanks everybody for indulging me in that. I think sometimes it's important that we do introduce ourselves, because it's like you got these guys on camera talking about whatever, psychotherapy concepts and, guns and mental health. And it's like, well, what are your credentials, right? Like who died and made you podcast kings of the guns and mental health world? So I figured it was nice to re-anchor. So today, I'm going to talk about a concept called the psyche. Now, you probably heard this around. People often misuse it. So I'm going to give some definitions. We're going to clarify. It'll be, it should be entertaining. And I want to start off with a story that I learned from Christian Conti. Take a drink. And I learned the way to present this from Dr. Conti when I was a wee pup back in graduate school. This works really well on a whiteboard. So if you want to recapture this at some point, you're listening, it's not making sense, you're having a hard time envisioning things, maybe you're driving and listening to us talk, I would highly recommend you not close your eyes when I say try to envision what I'm about to describe, because we don't need people steering off the road. But if you want to see a visual representation of this, the Zephyr Wellness YouTube channel has me in front of a whiteboard diagramming this stuff. So we'll try to do some hyperlinks to a visual sheet. So you can, if you want, you can poke around and look at that. But the idea is I want you to envision this stuff because it makes it a little more tangible and digestible. So let's start with definition of psyche. Psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E, psyche. And Psyche, as a Greek goddess, was said to be goddess of the human soul. So if we take the suffix ology, which you see in biology and geology and psychology, obviously, the suffix ology means the study of something. So if we slap them together, it's literally translated as the study of the human soul. And I think one of my great frustrations in counseling in the last 20 to 30 years is that we've moved away from talking about human souls and the depth that human souls have. Not deaf, Kevin, like you thought last time. This is depth psychology, not deaf psychology. We're moving away from that and looking more toward outward behaviors, which I say that frustrates me because humans are deeper than their behaviors. And that's the whole point of this conversation today, is to talk about how humans are greater than what they appear to be when you contact them. And that goes for a whole bunch of different presentations. So if we think the study of the soul, we can therefore translate soul to mean, psyche, and psyche to mean soul. But also people say that this is their mind. And we can have a hair-splitting debate over the difference between mind, soul, psyche, and among the three. But I'd rather just use them interchangeably today for today's purposes, because I don't want to overly confuse this or make it overly complicated. So the story about this that I got from Christian Conti was, imagine there's a little boy down at a river, right? And he's looking around, and he's pawing through, and he's getting water for his tribe to take back, and he stumbles across an old man who's there next to him, and the old man finds a precious gemstone, and it's very rare, and it's worth a lot, and he walks over and he hands it to the boy, and the boy says, "Oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, what are you giving this to me?" And the old man says, "Yep, take it. This is worth enough to get you and your family and your whole village out of poverty. You will never have to live here again." And he says, "Take it. Good luck and God bless." Right. And so the little boy looks at this. He can't believe what's just happened. He's so overwhelmed with excitement and gratitude and appreciation. Tears start streaming down his face. He says, "Thank you so much. Thank you so much." And he takes off running. He forgets his buckets that he was collecting the water with. He forgets that, he had some fish sitting there. He just runs, but he just takes off running, and he's running. and he starts to slow down as he's thinking, and he goes, "Hold on a second." He slows down. He comes to a complete stop. He turns around, runs right back to the river, and he runs up to the old man. He's out of breath. He says, "Old man, I don't want this." And he's like, "What, are you nuts? Like, I gave you this thing that's going to take your whole village out of poverty. Like, why are you giving it back to me?" He says, "I don't want that. What I want is whatever you have inside you that allowed you to give such a precious thing to someone like me." And the idea of the psyche is that at its inner core, there's something deeper and greater than we could ever measure in quantifiable human terms. It's greater than money. It's greater than precious gemstones. It's greater than any deeds or acts you could ever perform. So the idea is that the psyche, then, which lives within all of us, the soul of a human, is anchored by a divinity. It's useful if you believe in the divine, if you believe in God, as I'm talking this through, but I'm not attached to it. That's fine. I find that this model works really well to explain human behavior and give them meaning and purpose and so forth. But if you can let go of your certainty of reality for a second, at least entertain the idea that such a divine exists, then you can wrap your head a little bit easier around the idea of the soul. So let's talk about the parts of the psyche. Imagine, if you will, a circle. And we use a circle because this comes from Carl Jung, who we've mentioned before on this show. Jung did a lot of writing about conscious and unconscious function. And Jung used a circle. And even though the psyche, being divine as it is unlimited, you have unlimited potential in your soul, in your mind, in your depth of who you are. We have to use a circle because our minds can't really conceptualize eternity. We can't conceptualize infinity. So we'll consider a circle, right? And in that circle, the reason we use a circle is because Plato used a circle to represent the human soul, because it's never beginning and never ending. Now, sometimes in wedding ceremonies, they'll talk about the ring that goes on the finger as being representative of the love between two people that always was, always is, and always will be. And that's why we use a circle. It's never beginning, never ending, right? So if I draw a circle on the board, There's obviously a starting point where my marker touches, but let go of that for a minute and just imagine a perfect circle, and you can't see the beginning or the ending. Okay, that represents our soul. Now, inside that circle, we've got some parts. Somewhere in there is a line up near the top, and we'll just draw a line maybe 10% of the way down or 15% of the way down. So you got a smaller portion up top and a bigger portion at the bottom. Those two portions, the top represents your consciousness, meaning your awareness. It's just a fancy word for awareness. And the bottom is your unconscious. And that's the stuff you're not aware of. Now, remember, this is your soul. This is your psyche. And it contains all things great and terrible. But separating the two is this dividing line, awareness and unawareness. And the idea is the proportions are such that there's so much more to you that you don't know. And that part that you don't know is driving a great deal more of your behavior than you probably realize or give credit. Up above on the top, the smaller portion is your awareness. Those are the things you are aware of. And in there is something called an ego. The ego is simply the most familiar part of your awareness. It's the things you do all the time. It's your habits. It's maybe your home. And maybe if we analogize this a little further, it's a room in your home that you know super, super well. It might be your kitchen or your living room. It's the place that you go all the time. Your bedroom might be a little less familiar, but you're still pretty familiar. And maybe that like dark closet down in the basement that you hardly ever go and you just store things in. That's like you're aware of it, but it's somewhere off center, right? It's not in the unconscious because you know it's there. If we take that analogy of the house and we expand it to the neighborhood, the streets that you drive on regularly, maybe your office, that stuff's all still part of your awareness. It's all part of your consciousness, but it becomes a little further away from that ego center. And then we get to things that you don't know anything about. Maybe you've only heard about them, like the town 200 miles away, it's still in your state. Maybe a different state that you've never visited, maybe a different country. We could take this analogy pretty far, even insofar as to talk about maybe the ocean. A lot of people have never even been to the ocean, but let's say the ocean, right? Deep, deep, deep in the ocean where very few of us have ever gone. That might be analogous to your unconscious. You don't know what's down there. It's pretty dark. It's pretty scary. You lose light when you start to look in there. And I like this metaphor because it analogizes the depth of who we are compared to what we think we know really well. And the idea here is that if we move that dividing line that I talked about a little lower and a little lower and a little lower, and we expand our own personal awareness, we can eventually hit something, or at least approach it, called the true self. And the true self is that little spark of divinity I talked about. The true self is who you really are meant to be, how God made you to walk the earth. And the idea here is that somewhere deep within your unconscious is your true self. Now, here's what happens over time. Let's pretend that you're holding a brand new baby. And if you've ever had this pleasurable experience, it's pretty powerful. You got a brand new baby in your arms. The baby's just been born. It knows nothing of the world. We'll call it a blank slate, right? And if you're familiar with this Jungian work, just put a pin in that for a second because it's not quite true, but we'll come back to that. So the baby knows nothing of the world except which it gets taught. Now, over time, the baby will cry, it needs food. Mom may give it a breast to feed on, and the baby says, oh, okay, young. Okay, I got my food now. I'm connecting mom with food. I could probably trust mom. Now we extrapolate that to instructions. Keep your hands out of the light sockets. Don't cross into traffic. And over time, mom and dad and the voices of authority in this baby's life start to create its awareness, that little 10 or 15% of stuff that you know. And within that awareness becomes the stuff you know really well. That would be the baby's playroom, dinner table, that kind of thing. Over time, picture now in that circle that you're holding in your head, there's some information coming in from the side, from the outside of the circle. That would be the outside world. And it's being pushed into the baby's psyche, if you will. It's giving it ideas. It's giving it information. It's giving it a construct and a lens through which to view the world. And now it's not just mom and dad. It's the neighbors. It's the child's school teachers. It's the friends on the playground. It's the bullies on the playground. It's the TV they watch, the books that they read, the music they listen to, the clergy at church. All the messaging that comes from everywhere goes into that baby's psyche. And that baby grows up, it becomes a young child, then it becomes an adolescent, then it becomes an adult. And before it know it, this fully functioning human now has all these ideas. And Jung called those introjects. introjected beliefs, not to be confused with an interjection, which is when you jump into somebody's conversation without being invited, but an introjection is simply an unquestioned belief or an assumption about the way the world works. So all those ideas that go into that baby's head that then becomes an adult, they form how that person interacts with the world. And they don't bother to question it because first of all, they're too young. They don't know how. And then when we get older, it just becomes way too inefficient. So we listen to voices of authority. We listen to governmental agencies, and we listen to our bosses and the human resources people who tell us that's just the way it is, right? And the way you can identify some of these introjects in your own life is by use of the word should. If you hear yourself saying, or you hear somebody else saying, you should know, or you should just, or he should know better, that's a really good indication that you're listening to an introjected belief that's probably never been questioned. Other phrases might be ought to, or must, or have to, or like I mentioned before, that's just the way it is. That's how it's always been. That's an introjected belief. It's never been questioned. It's just taken on assumption, and it has a great deal of impact on how you interface with the world. Okay, so those introjected beliefs create this lens through which we see the world, and that becomes our ego. And we can picture maybe wearing goggles, like ego goggles. You put those on, they point you in the direction, and they kind of carve out a whole bunch of other things that you could be aware of. So the idea is that if we want to explore the great depth of who we are, we have to take off the ego goggles. We have to dissolve our egos, dissolve our awareness, and dip into something that's so much greater and so much more promising. The problem is it's really, really scary. And the reason it's scary is usually because people who take off their ego goggles or dissolve their ego and take away the familiarity, the comfortable, predictable way that they've always lived life, is that now they have to let go of that and embrace something else. And that something else might be unpredictable. So if we're looking deep within us, we end up having to explore the great potential for awesome and terrible simultaneously. You say, well, what's terrible about a divine soul, right? Well, through the Judeo-Christian belief system, at least, we're fallen creatures. We have sin within us. But we also have some pre-programmed knowledge about just the way the world works. And Jung would call these archetypes. And these archetypes, symbols, if you will, exist in something called the collective unconscious. It's an understanding that all people have about certain things. And there's myths in there, like flood myths and creation myths and wise old man archetype and hero archetype and nurturing mother archetype. And there's lots and lots of things that we just understand, irrespective of culture, upbringing, race, religion. These things pervade all of humanity. So living within us is some stuff that's pretty dark, as well as the light. So hang on to that for a second. I want to explain a different concept, and then we'll tie this up, and then we can take questions and feedback. So you got these introjections coming in from one side. They're coming in from the outside world into the psyche, creating your worldview, and you're marching forward, and you got these beliefs that you hang on to. Now, projected out, and that's a different term. Projections are things that you throw onto the outside world that are not necessarily accurate, but they come from your unconscious belief system. So I'm going to go through some projections here. There's basically 4 major types of projections, and you'll probably be really familiar with this. So the first one I want to talk about is the anima or animus projection. The anima is the feminine counterpart to the masculine psyche, and the animus is the masculine counterpart to the feminine psyche. And the cool thing is here is we have both of these within all of us. We all have the ability to be masculine or feminine in the traditional sense, if you will, and it is definitely on a spectrum or a continuum. So let me give an example here. So pretend you're at a bar and you see somebody you think is just super amazing, and you walk up and you're like, oh, you're super amazing, let me buy you a drink. And then that person opens their mouth and you're like, oh, wow, you're actually just a blithering idiot. That stinks. And you regret walking up. They've disappointed you. And what happens is you've projected if you're a woman, you've projected your animus onto the man. And if you're a man, you've projected your anima onto the lady at the bar. And so what we'll do is we'll be disappointed. We'll realize that our projection of that person didn't match what reality had given us. So if I see some, cute person. She's smiling, she's bubbly, she's talking with her friends, and I'm starting to project a whole bunch of things like, oh, I bet she's amazing. She's got a great personality. She's probably super successful. She's really educated. She's probably gonna be a great mom one day. And then I walk up and she's an idiot. Then I'm like, oh, give me my anima back. I'm gonna take that back and project it on somebody else later. So we want to be mindful that the qualities we're ascribing to people we don't actually know is likely a projection. So the masculine feminine thing is something that we want to be mindful of. And usually where this comes from is our own interactions from childhood all the way through adulthood based on our interactions with males and females. So if you come from, say, a broken home where dad isn't present, you might start taking your idea of what dad looks like from movies, media, TV, books, magazines, whatnot. And then you move through life and you're projecting onto dad-looking figures the idea of dad that's not real based on some caricatures, perhaps. And then you're inevitably going to be disappointed because it doesn't align with reality. Same thing with mom, same thing with girlfriend, whatnot. So the anima animus is something to keep in mind. It's something that we project onto the world based on our upbringing and how we are basically taught to see things. Okay. So the second projection is a persona projection. And that's simply explained as the mask that we wear. You can say personas or personae. It'd be a persona with an E at the end of it. Personae is plural, or personas. Either one works. And that's a mask that we wear. So if you have somebody inside you that nobody knows but you, but you cover that up if you go into a party or you hang out with a different crowd than you normally do. Maybe you dress up for a certain occasion. What you're doing is you're projecting onto the group or the situation something that you think they need you to be. So you'll wear this mask based on, again, what you've introjected to believe that group needs. So I'm going to get granular with this. I used to work in politics, volunteering for campaigns and such when I was much younger, and I would stand up a little straighter and wear my blue blazer, and I'd go park cars for the fundraiser or whatever. And that was a mask that I was wearing. That wasn't authentically me. Besides, who knows who they really are when they're 20? So I was projecting. I would project a persona around my fraternity. I would project a persona around the sports teams that I was on. And then as I got older, and especially with assistance through going through the grad program, I realized that this concept of the true self, the inner, way that God made me to be, I had to try to achieve that with the best accuracy I could so that I no longer had to wear masks in different settings. I'd be a different person around my grandparents than I would around my, my colleagues at work or, whatever it is. So now, at the age of 45 years old, I can comfortably say that I'm closer to being authentic as consistently as possible across all domains. So if you were to see me in the counseling setting, or you see me at church, or you see me on the ball field, or you see me coaching my kids, or you see me playing music, or whatever I'm doing, I'm going to be the same dude. Hopefully, that's what I'm striving for. I'm striving for authenticity so that I don't have to project a persona that's then going to fool other people or fool myself. And some examples of this might be like tough guy, or slutty, or foul-mouthed, or goody two-shoes. When we start to label people, it's usually our interpretation of either what they're projecting with their persona or something we're projecting onto them that we want them to be. All right, so 2 more. I'm going to do a quick exercise with everybody, if you wouldn't mind clearing your heads real quick, and think about, and I will get to the chat in a minute, but think about something that absolutely drives you crazy about people or a person specifically. So think about something that really, really drives you nuts. And I want to pause here, and I want to get some feedback from the guys on here and online. What's something that just drives you bonkers about people, really frustrates you?
When there's a big line of cars and somebody cuts in the lane, drives all the way to the front, and then tries to sneak in.
Okay. Keep going. What else? Brandon?
It's funny you went with cars. I was thinking something similar. I'm thinking the left lane Larry is just hanging out there. I'm doing the speed limit. So anybody wanting to go faster than me is breaking the law.
I would just say rudeness and people not minding their manners.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with judgmental people.
Okay.
It makes me nuts.
Ghost was active in the chat, but I don't see him typing anything in. But things that are like things that really piss you off, right? Okay. Now here's where the exercise takes a bit of a turn. I will bet that what you just shared is something that you yourself have done. Can we
All
agree
the
with that?
time.
Okay. Have you been left lane Larry, DB? Have you played sheriff on the highway?
Oh, I'm playing sheriff, but from the right lane. As I'm like, all right, screw it. I'm going around you. I'm doing this to the right. Like, we're gonna play this way.
Yeah. Brandon, Kevin, you guys agree? Like you've been that person, right? That you just described that you can't stand. Yeah.
Not often, but the other day, an opening just magically came. I was going to go around a roundabout way, but an opening came in the lane and I took it. So, yeah, I guess
Of course
so.
it did. Yeah. All right. So when I did this exercise for the first time back in, I think it was 2007 or early 2008, the thing that jumped into my head was child molestation. And I'm not cool with that. And it drives me bonkers. I can't stand it. And then when Christian Conti, take a drink, when he said what I just said, which is that's something within you that you probably have done before. And I was like, no, I haven't. He's like, yeah, but are you capable of it? And I said, no, absolutely not. Like I was in complete denial of this blind spot in my psyche. And then I learned it's not about the deed. It's about the spirit behind the deed. So in there, Mike said something about judgmentalism. He didn't give an example of it, but he described it. And I think Brandon said rude or discourteous or something. That's the spirit behind the deed. So what's the spirit behind the deed of child molestation? Victimization, breaking trust, something like that. I absolutely am capable of doing all those things. Now, my introjected path is not one to molest children. My introjected path, if I'm going to do something that violates trust or breaks boundaries or, is rude or disrespectful or judgmental or any of those things that we said that we don't like, it's going to come out in a different form, right? So I might lie. I might cheat on a test, something like that. And absolutely, I've done those things. I'm certainly capable of them. So the idea is that we want to get people to consider that they have the capacity to do this. There's a saying that goes, if a human being has done a thing, that thing is therefore human nature. All of us being humans have the same nature as any other human, and therefore we have the same capacity to do anything that any other human has ever done, from conquering countries to genocidal oppression to creativity and entrepreneurship to philanthropic endeavors to all the things, great and terrible. So this concept is called the shadow. It's the shadow aspect of our psyche when we're real quick to point out something in somebody else that we don't want to look at in ourselves. There's a lot of descriptions across time and culture and literature. One of them is whenever you point a finger, three are pointing back at you. Another one is the yin and the yang from Taoism. There's a little bit of light in the dark. There's a little bit of dark in the light. Another one is from scripture. I think it's from Matthew in the Bible that says, mind the plank in your own eye before pointing out the speck in someone else's. So irrespective of culture, irrespective of doctrine, religion, upbringing, we all have this concept of that which we don't want to look at in ourselves. We're real quick to point out in other people. That's a shadow projection. Usually it takes the form of the darkness, right? We don't want to look at the dark, ugly things. We'll look at them in other people and be like, yeah, I could never be like him. But there's also a golden shadow to this, and it's the same phraseology, only for something we don't think we can achieve that's quite good, say philanthropy or entrepreneurship or whatever of those things I said before, maybe excelling in competition, for example. And I go, I could never be like that. And before he became super weird, I used to use Bill Gates as the example. Like people be like, I could never be like that. It's like billionaire. No, that's the deed behind the spirit, that outcomes from the spirit. The spirit behind it is hard work, creativity, innovation, all that stuff. I don't know who I would use now to maybe Elon Musk. I don't know. He's getting a little weird too, but the idea is that these guys have done great things. And a lot of us are self-limiting to say, I could never do that. And when we do that, we're carving out parts of our own psyche. And I don't want to do that with people. I don't want to limit human beings. So Can you ever dunk a basketball? I don't know. You're probably not built for it. That's not the point. That's a deed. Can you endeavor really well to play basketball? Yeah, probably, right? So we want to make sure that we're helping people to embrace their entirety, the fullness of the inner divine that they have, and embrace things that are great and terrible. Now, we don't necessarily want to just give over to the terrible things. What we want to do is we want to acknowledge them and then choose differently. And I think it's inspiring, honestly, like to think that we have within us all the potential that any human being has ever done walking the earth. So that's projection number 4. The last one is simply a true self projection. Every once in a while, we'll find ourselves doing something that just is completely harmonious, free of introjections, and our true self emerges. And we do something, go, yeah, that was authentically me. Man, that felt good, right? And then, like, poof, it's gone because it came from our unconscious. If our true self lives in the unconscious part of our psyche, then it can show up from time to time, and then it disappears almost as quickly as it showed up, because what happens is the ego snaps back into place. We can't rest very long in our true self because it's frightening. And also it's kind of like touching God, which is why I said earlier, I think all we can ever do is approach true self through a lifetime of exploration and, analysis and depth research. We can approach it, because if we ever really land on saying, I am fully differentiated, or I'm fully individuated, or I am fully arrived at my true self, I think what we're doing is we're putting ourselves on a plateau with God, and I'm not arrogant enough to think that we'll ever get there. So that is essentially the overview. There's so much more to talk about. I mean, we talked about defensive functioning several weeks ago that keeps us in our ego state. You can go back and listen to that podcast. And there's stuff to talk about with the collective unconscious. There's dream interpretation that comes along with this, because that's Jung's expression. He says that's the psyche's expression, trying to tell us to get on track or to steer some different way in life, but we lack the language to interpret it. So there's lots of different directions to go with this, but we can kind of shift gears and maybe get some feedback. Or I just dropped the mic and nobody has it.
Jake, you talked about your true self, of kind of a moment of like, that's me. Is that immune to others' kind of reaction and judgment? Or if you felt good, somebody reacts negatively, maybe shamefully, does that kind of counter that?
So in my experience, when we act out of a sense of authenticity, near as we can achieve it, I think that threatens other people's egos. So if you got we'll just say a room full of people, we'll say a baseball team, right? You got different personalities, you got people from different walks of life, whatnot, and we're all in our egos in some form or another, because ego is just simply the default, simplest way to interact with life. There's no judgment there. I know people will say ego is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It just is. It's just the simple, easiest, low-hanging fruit way to live life. Okay, everybody's working out of their egos. And if you got somebody who's a little more authentic, and they're embracing life a little more authentically, and they're maybe raising some questions that other people who are living in their egos haven't considered, what that does is it pings some insecurities. And the reason it pings insecurities is because if the ego-driven person is only operating out of introjected belief that they haven't examined yet, what they're doing is they're inherently being challenged on those beliefs. So let's take that baseball team and say there's multiple races on the baseball team, and one guy, he's a white guy, and he's been told over time, he's been introjected to believe that, like, dark-skinned people are not good, and we're to be suspicious of them. Okay. Dark-skinned guy, could be Caribbean, could be black, whatever. He walks up and he's like, hey, nice to meet you. Love to hang out and go to dinner sometime. Dark-skinned dude is operating from an authentic sense of self. In this case, white-skinned dude is like, I don't know what to make of this. His ego is being threatened, right? And my experience is that when you operate out of a sense of authenticity, the other people who are operating out of their insecurities, and they're projecting, and they're just defaulting to their introjected beliefs, which, by the way, aren't even theirs. It's really interesting. We can have these tightly held beliefs about politics and religion and economics and all sorts of things, but they're not even ours. They were given to us over time, and we get super defensive about it. Like, hey, how dare you question blue team and red team? And it's like, well, where'd you learn that? They can get defensive, and then we get that negative interaction, I think. So it's you do get judgment. I think that the true self in and of itself is immune, but when you operate out of it, you almost provoke judgmentalism, because those people who are operating out of their egos will dig their heels in to do anything except leave their ego state, because it's scary to leave your ego state and let go of what you think you know really well to embrace something possibly better, but certainly different, if that makes sense.
So yeah, I kind of had a question based on that. So I wanted to go back to Ghost Tactical a little bit ago, made a comment in the chat just about how parenting is really important just because of like the interjections and stuff like that. And me thinking about like some of the trauma work I do, like when, like young kids, like if they're abused growing up and that stuff is being normalized to them. That's why a lot of times people grow up and they, do those same things to their children. In a less extreme example, think about firearms. A lot of people have, these biases on firearms because they are just told their whole lives that guns are bad. So kind of like you were talking earlier, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this question from like a developmental stage, like you're being fed all this information and it's kind of like shaping that because of when you're in adulthood, why is it so hard to break that?
I think the simple answer is because it's patterned, and patterns tend to become very predictable, comfortable, familiar, and it's hard to leave them. So like any habit that you develop, the longer you do it, the harder it is to change it. Because if you're not good at self-examination, and you're not good at non-attachment, and you're not good at dealing with emotional function, what ends up happening is you conflate what you do with who you are. And a lot of times what we do, when it gets conflated with who we are, challenges us in a very raw, exposing way when the thing we do gets questioned. So if I go to you and go, I don't know that playing guitar is really for you, man. I've been listening. You're not very good. You're going to have a defensive response to that because you put in a lot of time and effort and you've been doing it for a really long time. Now, here's the trick though. If you have comfortably analyzed your introjected beliefs, the way you're raised, the understanding you have of the world, your interpretations, any opinion, basically, anything that comes from the frontal lobe, if you've honestly endeavored to pick those apart and know where they come from and why you believe it, which, by the way, is why I love the word intentionality. If you have intentionality, you're in control of your decisions and your choices. So if you've honestly endeavored to examine your beliefs and you picked them apart and you put them back together, and that's a key too. We can't just deconstruct without reconstructing. Then when challenged, you can go, hey, that's, I hear you. Maybe it's not your kind of music. I don't know. I'm always working to improve. I'll listen to your feedback. And you can be non-attached to it because you've examined the belief and you've made it your own. If it's not your own, that's usually when we get defensive. Because if it is your own, there's nothing to be defensive about. It's your own. You can just stand on it. I don't feel one way or the other about it. So that's my feedback. I think if it over time, the reason that it's hard to change is because habits get ingrained and we fail to separate the thing from who we are at our core, our true self. And I say frequently, like I'm trying to work myself out of a job as a therapist because therapist is not my identity. It's a job that I do. I'm very passionate about it. I can be passionate and non-attached simultaneously. But if there comes a day that everybody in town is healed and I have to close up Zephyr and reinvent myself, okay, no big deal. God didn't make me a therapist. God made me to be a whole bunch of things depending on the season in which I'm called to do those things.
A key point that you mentioned there is, are we able to take feedback, contradictory or difficult feedback? That's a pretty good telltale sign of where we're operating. And that immediate push to defensiveness, hopefully, is that red flag on the play that, okay, something needs to stop right here. And so when I find myself doing that, which of course I do get defensive. I do take offense at things. Usually it's an after action if I'm not quick enough to catch it. That, well, I'm on my heels in this moment, and that hopefully is the sign that I could have taken that feedback. And it doesn't mean the person is right. It doesn't mean that they're correct. It doesn't mean that they weren't being an ass. All that is separate. It's a whole different thing. But the point is, how did I receive it? And the ownership of that is on me. So where do I go with that? I was thinking, why do adults, get worse and worse at this or cover that? Well, habit, of course. I think to some extent, those who are still thinking and not just becoming really, really good at just operating, just doing, and being in the ego state constantly, because they've specialized that. I think to go right back into this self-conscious, or so the unconscious, we're self-conscious that we know that we are not doing that. So if we look at somebody who is really achieving, we want to drag them back down to where we are. If we look at somebody who is, we believe, is lesser than us, we're like, well, hey, look at me. I did the bootstraps. And so we want everybody to be right where we are, to some degree, probably a little lower than us, ideally, because that makes us feel better. But not too low where we have to bother with them. So we are constantly trending toward that. We want people to be a lot like us, a little lower than us, and we don't want to be necessarily too good, because then we'd be too responsible. People might call on us to get some stuff done. And so there's this kind of homeostasis thing that we want to drive everyone into, especially if it means that we don't have to do much more. I love the conversation that Chad Wright had on the Rick Roll podcast. It was years ago, and he was talking about the power of speech and the idea that he only utters verbally. And of course, this is a practice that he's had to maintain over time. Chad Wright, former Navy SEAL and ultra runner, and so he focuses very hard on, you can think whatever you want in your mind, because it's going to happen. You're going to think all kinds of crazy things. The mind goes where it goes, and we can be more focused on that over time. But what he actually puts into words are only things that he can stand by. So like, this hurts, for example, or this sucks, as he's doing a run. Like, of course it sucks. Of course it hurts. But I'm not going to put those things to words, because they take on reality then. That's a whole different conversation. We may have thoughts, but when we speak something, it is now, well, I guess in a biblical sense, it's flesh. We have now created something out of the unconscious and into the present being. Now, it may not be that I can create things by saying things. That's not my point. But I can greatly shift what's going on in the room by saying something that we may all be thinking. So that ability to hold with difficult circumstances and then pull deeper from the well of, I'll say, of truth, that what I can do in this moment is I can work harder. I can dig deeper. I can recognize that I have been through tough things and I can get through this. And that would be I suppose that'd be my comment on where could we go with this whole unconscious, iceberg of things. If we are only this tiny percentage of ourselves, what is in this remaining well, this 90, roughly 90% of the rest of our possibility?
I think that's why it's so important that we have people to look to, like the guys you mentioned on the podcast, or the people who have achieved great things, the David Gogginses of the world or whatever, is that we see in them what we hopefully want to see in ourselves. Now, the denial part that I mentioned about the shadow, where I could never do that, and then we resign ourselves to mediocrity, is not the direction we want to go. We want to chase the people who have done things before. It's a funny little thing, like Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within, and Buddhists say that the only difference between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist is that non-Buddhists think there's a difference. So like, the aspect of Buddhahood, the aspect of God is within all of us. And the idea is that the true self is constantly knocking. It's like, knock, knock, knock. Hey, there's more to you than you realize. And the ego doesn't want to go there, because the ego itself has an invested desire to stay where it is. The ego doesn't want to dissolve. The ego loves being an ego. So we have to reconcile that knocking. And one of the cool things I think about dream interpretation or dream analysis is that through the dream, through the imagery that the dreams give us, is that it's that recognition that the knocking of the true self, that divinity within you, is calling you to somewhere. If your life is perfectly on track with the way that you're supposed to be walking, you won't have any dreams, because there's nothing to deviate or alter. when you have the most vivid dreams, especially when they're recurrent, that's in my experience when people are like really getting off kilter, they're off course, and we have to pay attention to that to pull us back on. Kevin mentioned something in the chat. He says the opposite of social media interactions where everybody's prompted to have a stance and opinion. It's like, yeah, but that's your ego. That's the ego saying, I affirmatively state X. And it's like, no, if we all have great potential and we're all connected and we all have the same capacity, then there is no certainty to be declared. Now, there's certainly right or wrong, and we can debate that, based on worldview and perspective. But again, worldview and perspective are interjected ideas. So we want to be non-attached. We want to be grounded, and also receive new information that says maybe you haven't figured everything out. Because if you have, then you are God, and nobody's going to get there. So
let's be clear. I mean, one of the best ways to ensure that you stay in the ego and never get into thought about what am I capable of is right here. This is a perfectly designed device to keep us.
DB's holding his phone for those of you who can't see it.
Exactly. For those on the airwaves, the being stuck in something that's constantly spinning is absolutely contrary to getting tough experiences, getting out and being reflective, being contemplative. And frankly, that is what's required for the task of looking deeper. It can't be on the screen. That can be inspiring. That could inspire us to do that work, but then the work still must be done. So this little scrolly device is a perfect medium to stay constantly in the ego.
It becomes a feedback loop, right? You get into an echo chamber, and it gives you what you already seek to believe, which is something we call confirmation bias. So if you're just chasing down your own biases to confirm what you think you already know, you just reinforce your own ego state instead of being non-attached and saying, well, maybe I don't know everything here. I got into there's been several times that I've gotten into what the other people thought were pretty heated discussions when I'm just going, I don't know, man. I don't know. And they're like, I do know. Like, oh, execute every child molester. It's like, so you're saying that there's no possibility for rehabilitation? Well, I'm not saying that. It's like, yeah, you are actually. You're saying there's no possibility that this person could ever rehabilitate from the crime that they committed, right? That's what we're saying. And they can't reconcile what I just said, which is a non-attached challenging of their cartoon world with actual reality that means it's possible. They can't reconcile. So then we get a limbic defensive response. We get fear. We get attacking. We get denigration. We get name calling. And all I did was just offer something. I've done that in boards and committees and coalitions and text threads and like all sorts of leadership positions where I'm just like, hey, did anybody consider this? And they're like, well, why would we consider that when we've been doing it this way for as long as we have? It's like, I don't know, maybe it's better. Like, whoa. Do you know who came up with that? I'm like, I don't really care who came up with it. So there's ego defense involved in things that people have created and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah,
Michael, go ahead. Yeah.
No, sorry, I was just going to say it's like think about the debates within the gun community, right? Like, what are we always debating? Red flag laws.
Glock versus 1911. Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's amongst ourselves. But I'm talking about with the other side, right? Like we're always doing red flag laws. We're always talking about waiting periods. And it's always funny when like people will ask me, right? Like I got a text from Russell Lemley, who's been a guest on our show the other day. He's like, what do you think of waiting periods? And I don't agree with them. I think the overall, it does nothing, but I would also be fooling myself if I sit here and say time and space when someone's in crisis, if that waiting period wouldn't have helped. I mean, I think that I'd be lying, right? Like you can't have it both ways. You have to be able to examine it. I just think the overall, for as many guns are purchased, for the amount of people that buy guns, waiting periods are ineffective. But that's not to say that I haven't seen situations where, I've as a rep for a firearms manufacturer, I walked into a store one time and I was like, hey, I'm the Bursa rep. And I remember this like clearly, like his face to this day, he was like, I sold a Bursa to someone last night that killed themselves. Right. And I remember like, I think he was kind of going through it, and that was just his way of talking to me about it. And I remember I was just like, "What happened?" And he like went through the process. The lady who bought the firearm, um, and so I brought that story up to Russell. I was like, to say that a waiting period wouldn't have helped that woman. Absolutely, it probably would have, right? I mean, it's worth a shot, but overall, let's face it, millions of guns are sold constantly, right? Like, I don't think they're effective, and I think it inconveniences more people than it does, positive when it saves a life if it would have, right? No one knows that, and that's the unknown. So it's the struggles that we go through in the gun community, is having these conversations without getting emotionally angry because the so-called enemy has these points that they want to bring up, and there's no nuance when it's discussed usually, especially when you talk about the echo chamber, DB, right? Like, it's like, and those things can get you drummed out of your circle too if you kind of bring those things up. So you got to be careful about that.
Yeah, you have to bring it through this particular filter. What you're describing is a whole bunch of people with ego presentations who I would loosely say want to control outcomes so they are comfortable. So we'll just blanket a law for everybody. Well, the pushback to that is, well, what if the person needs it immediately for good purpose? How do you reconcile that? And the simple answer is you submit to the authentic true self of the individuals along the way. There is no such thing as an all binding, purposeful for everyone policy. That's nonsense. There's never been such a thing. I don't even care what policy you drug up. It's not useful for every single person that it's binding upon. There just isn't one. I can't think of one. I've done this mental exercise a zillion times, from seatbelts to continuing education credits to contractors' requirements for homes. Like, every law is an attempt at a minimum standard that will be binding upon all people to whom it applies. You almost inherently limit the maximum standard when you do such a thing, almost. And at max, you've just set what the minimum is, and the minimum is usually not well studied anyway. So, yeah, and here's the thing: it's terrifying to the individual who's ego bound or insecure, who hasn't examined his introjected beliefs, to hand over authority to an autonomous person to say, "I trust you and your true self to guide you." That's real libertarianism, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that people who are investigating, being reflective, thinking based on the experience and of their own time in the woods in the backcountry or their own time with other people are really, really hard to govern. And to be clear, I mean, that is at the center on the societal level of this. The cell phone, or smartphone rather, is a perfect device. It's not a psyop, although if it were well chosen, the cell phone is a great device that helps to funnel people toward a binary set of thoughts. And it is absolutely true that free thinking societies are very, very difficult to govern. And it's very, very uncomfortable when a person just wants to say, well, are you for this or for that? And the person is able to recognize that, just as Jake said, or Michael, there's so much nuance to this. And that doesn't mean that one's not better than the other. Sometimes one is clearly the better one. But as Jake just said, it's not going to be 100% in all situations. I was trying to think through the example as well of, okay, well, it must be a policy, like, be kind to everyone. Well, I think that breaks down pretty quick. Don't incarcerate, blah, blah. Okay, well, what about, so we can immediately come up with, in probably most circumstances, the contrary to that. Well, obviously in this case, that doesn't hold. That becomes the problem for a society that wants to govern, and which is an important question. How, maybe it is the government that governs the least governs the best, but that's not a very efficient system.
No, it's not. And I love that you're saying that, because if we take it back to the carving out parts of ourselves and denial, there's a Jungian quote that says, that which we resist persists. So if you live in denial that there's a piece of you that doesn't live there, you're more likely to act it out later unconsciously. If you say, like, I could never blah, blah, blah. Well, whatever you blah, blah, blah is probably going to come out at some point, because you've spent so much time denying that it's a part of you. One great example that I heard another clinician share about a guy he was treating, he had anger issues for years and years, got him in a lot of trouble. So now he's done what Jung would call enantiodromic response. So N in anti, opposite. Dromea is a Greek word for running. You can think of like dromedary camels, they run together. So enantiodromic is running in the opposite. And then parenthetically, it's the direction of what we know really well. So this guy's running in the opposite direction of his anger and violence and whatnot. He's like totally at peace. He's got kids. He's like, I will never do that again. That's not a part of me. I've put it to bed. I've buried it. And the clinician was telling me, he says, you're telling me that you just would never, ever break a law, go speed, go too fast on the highway. You never, ever. You're just totally at peace. And he's like, yep, it's dead. It's dead. It's dead. And he says, I could see the conflict in this guy's eyes. Like, did I really? And so he gave him an answer. Hypothetically, he says, so what happens if you, he says, you coach football, right? I say, yeah. I love, coach football, coach my kids. Says, if one of them like just totally broke his leg, blew out his knee, something happened in practice, and the ambulance was like not going to get there, you're telling me you wouldn't pile him in your truck and go bouncing over some curbs and blowing some red lights to get him to the hospital? And he's like, well, that's a pretty good point. I probably would. He goes, you need that. You can't just carve out aggression because in the past you inappropriately used it unconsciously. You have to embrace it and know that it's there if necessary. And I think, thinking back to like the most ungovernable people are the ones who are free thinkers. Upon all the boards that I've ever sat or chaired, I think one of the cool things that I've done is I've invited people to think confidently in the face of binary presentations. Like we'll be considering some policy or some action, and there will be the camp that wants to do X and the camp that wants to do Y. And the most dangerous people are the ones who go, what about X and Y? And have you considered Z? Can we do all three? And it's right. There's like an ego loss there. Like camp X and camp Y absolutely need X and Y, or Y, X or Y to happen. And they're like not even thinking about Z. And when you present Z in a way to wrap X and Y together, they're like, but my ego, my whole identity is pitched on X. If I let go of X, what does that make me? It's like, I don't know, bigger than X. It's threatening. It's super threatening. But the people who get that invitation to participate, especially the public participants who believe that they show up to these meetings, they never get a voice. When I go, no, talk as long as you want. We're here to serve you. It's like, really? Yeah. And then of course, there's invested parties around the room who don't want that to happen, right? But I'm the board chair. I can do what I want, and you're going to talk. So I want you to talk, and I want you to participate. And it slowly moves the conversation into something more autonomous, more authentic. Nobody has to put up their personas. They don't have to put up their projections, and they can actually be authentic and be heard. And honestly, that's what moves things forward. Much to the chagrin of those who have an ego death to suffer.
So a risk in this, I think that it takes time. It takes experience to go deeper. And that doesn't mean that you need to, go on a sabbatical to India for this, although kudos if you do that, or hike up the mountain. I would say absolutely. There's so many examples that we have across faith traditions.
Psychedelic experience. We just talked about that, right?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the conversation, right? But it does take time. It takes time. It takes focus. It takes coming back to that in order to be intentional about disciplining yourself to remember that it's not just X and Y. I'll often say with a patient that, okay, now here's probably two most likely things, but let's be clear. There's probably 17 other possibilities in this. There's probably 17 other ways this could go. but ultimately you're gonna act one of these out. And so, are we willing to take the time to drop into some reflection, to take this on ourselves? It's much easier to just look and blame others, right? So if this is uncomfortable, I've got to look for somebody who's caused my uncomfort or my discomfort. And it's really, really inconvenient when I'm part of it. So although that's the path that gives me something to move forward with, is what can I do in this scenario to make things better for myself, for others. That's the part we can actually have agency.
Yeah, Kevin's got a great question, but I want to make a point here real quick. So, we talked a little bit about William Glasser, I think, at one point in a different podcast. And Glasser's whole pitch is that almost everything in our life is a choice, except for feeling and physiology. But we can often be unaware of those choices if we're locked in our egos and we're stuck in, limited vision, if you will. And so the interesting thing about increasing your consciousness and challenging your unconscious is that it opens up the opportunity for more choice. More choice equals more opportunity. More opportunity gets you closer to what you really want. Get you closer to what you really want gets you happier and more at peace. So if you can better communicate your wants, you can more easily meet your needs. And when our needs are met, we live happier, fuller, more fulfilling lives, right? So it all starts with personal awareness and the ability to let go of what we think we know for what's actually required or what we're actually called to do. Because as we open up our awareness, we'll see that the options expand. Of course, that threatens the people who have something invested in keeping options limited, because typically they're trying to control folks. So, Kevin, ask that question. It's a really good one. We can whip it around.
Yeah, I was wondering how each of you kind of mental health professionals help somebody that's kind of sitting in the ego responses and help them kind of shift away from that mindset. DB?
Yeah. Oh. No, so
We're all pointing at each other.
Yeah. So one technique I have is if people are or if patients are in our office, they clearly want to change. So if there is something that, unless they're like court mandated or something like that, but
or have personality disorders, and they're only there to perform.
Yes.
I want to put that asterisk in there too.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I'd say in my experience, in a lot of cases, in most cases, people are wanting to be there for some reason. And a lot of times, when you challenge them, you get some reluctancy because they're, like you mentioned, Kevin, they're stuck in their egos. So one question that I ask a lot is, well, it seems like, you're here because you want to change. And then I'll kind of use that as a segue to get them to, rethink. An example is just yesterday, I had one of my patients make a really big breakthrough. Kind of going back to the trauma point I brought up earlier, really traumatic upbringing. And, this patient really struggled to do things for themselves. And when they did things for themselves, they felt very, very, very guilty. And, we spent a lot of time, working on that. And they made a big decision that hurt somebody else, but it was a good decision for themselves. And they were kind of like saying, I felt really guilty about this. But on the other hand, I feel a lot better now that I made this decision for myself. So they're just, kind of commending them for, making that, and kind of going back to what Jake was saying earlier about the patterns. There's been this whole long pattern, and being able to point that out to them. So those are a couple things that I do.
Pattern awareness is a good one.
Mm-hmm. The other part, we talk about needs. I mean, Ghost Tactical put it in the chat, it's wanting to change and knowing what you want out of it is sometimes a thin line. Ego and pride are a real thing. Yeah, absolutely. I would also note, kind of continuing that train, that pretty often we conflate our wants with our needs. That we might say, well, this is what I need right now. And I might often say, what we need in most situations would be food, shelter. In fact, probably less food than we have. Shelter, these kind of basic Maslow hierarchy level stuff. And and probably for most of us in the West, way less than we already have. And so getting a sense of like, actually the things that I think that I need, most people would call those gifts or wants. And if I can check myself in that, I might recalibrate what I'm expecting of the world. Because typically by need, I mean, I need you to give me this. And do I really? I just want you to give me that. And for what? Probably for my ego. It's going to confirm what I want to think about myself. And until you're willing to bend on that, hey, go kick rocks because I got my needs. And that's often a place where I'll be having that conversation, calmly and with time. There's no need to press that and you put the pressure cooker on that. Just talk about simple things. What do we expect of others? For example, it tends to be a good place to start. If we're not willing to reciprocate the things that we want, or we quote unquote need from others, well, maybe it's not a need for us either.
Okay, so let me take this in reverse order because DB brought up something there, and there's some stuff in the chat I want to address. So, first of all, hi to Anderson Manufacturing. Asking somebody what they expect of others is a question that will invoke defensiveness because it invites the person to look at their unconscious expectations. When I talk about emotional functioning and the emotion of sadness is when our expectations don't get met. Most of our expectations are, in fact, unconscious. It's exceedingly rare that we know what we want and then don't get it and become super disappointed. Usually when we're disappointed, it's because we get something that we unconsciously thought would happen. And we don't voice those things. And the example I always use is, getting your shoe stepped on and being given a flat tire. Like, you don't expect your shoe not to get stepped on until the expectation is not met. And then you're like, hey man, you stepped on my shoe, right? Most of life is like that. So asking somebody what they expect is a very challenging assignment because we don't really think about it. And it invites vulnerability because they're having to examine what they actually want from people. And then the follow-up is inherently, whether we say it or not, it's implied that, have you asked? and a lot of times, especially in coupled relationships, like I'm talking romantic couple relationships, that takes the perceived exhilaration out of it. And when you take the perceived exhilaration out of it, you remove the romanticism, and then you're flying in the face of culture that says, he'll just read your mind and get you the diamond earrings or whatever. And my pushback to that is, no, absolutely express what you want so you can get it, so you can be happy. And I tell couples to put sex on the calendar too. Like, we don't have sex. It's busy. Kids, blah, blah, blah. I said, put it on the calendar. What? That takes the fun out of it. That takes the spontaneity. I said, listen, you ever gone over, watch a ball game in San Francisco, drive over the hill, make the trip, right? Buy the tickets, put that on the calendar, right? Yeah. Does it take the fun away? No. So put sex on the calendar and communicate what you really want. However, you're having to hand it over to somebody else to fulfill your desires. And that is usually the sticking point for people who are operating out of their ego, who've come from abusive or neglectful upbringings, who don't trust, who've been violated a million different ways. They don't want to hand over that power to somebody to fulfill their desires. It's just too scary. It's easier to keep it inside your head and then just complain when it doesn't happen, right? That gets into the guilt. So Ghost Tactical asks, guilt about getting better, is that common? And then C&T says, is it guilt for getting better or getting better and guilt for what you did or didn't do? And so let's see if I could take this. Guilt about getting better is a real thing if you have lack of self-efficacy to the point that you don't believe that you deserve being well or being healthy or succeeding or any of those things. So when we talk about people who are, quote unquote, have a fear of success, usually that's what stands in the way. They don't have the strength, the spine, the innate self-efficacy or the taught self-efficacy to say you are good enough, you are smart enough, and doggone it, people like you, like Stuart Smalley. If you do, you have no problem daring great things and succeeding and saying, yeah, this was great, this was awesome, I took a risk and it worked out. or doing the right thing. And I just recently got news of a guy in, I think, Minnesota who's being punished by the court system for he's on trial, which is unbelievable to me, for exposing a deputy who was soliciting minors for stuff. And instead of like being like, bravo, cool, they're trying to bury this guy because the ego of the system of policing is protecting itself and trying to kick out the accountability person. So there's some guilt that will keep us from reconciling even bad things, right? It'll say, it's just let it go. It's not worth it. Not worth getting exposed. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation as this just hit my radar. But systems will have their own egos too, and they will defend that against outward attacks that threaten to change the system. Systems can also have personality disorders. You can have a narcissistic system too. And at one point, we'll have Joshua Slocum on to talk about that. He hosts a podcast called Disaffected, and I'm excited to talk about cluster B. But to answer Kevin's question, my favorite way to challenge somebody's ego, and to DB's point, you don't want to do this right away in the therapeutic relationship because you can blow them out. It becomes offensive. It's confrontational. You don't just be like, oh, I notice these bad patterns in your life. Why don't you change them? So my favorite phrase, though, is I wonder. And I do it with all humility and curiosity. I go, I wonder, I wonder if you maybe need a new job. I wonder. I'm not telling them to get a new job. I'm just wondering, do you need a new job? And sometimes that's all it takes for them to go, oh, man, I'm rolling around in my head and wondering if I needed to quit my job and go get another career. Thank you for saying that. I thought I was alone. They're too afraid to say it. They're too afraid to come out because it threatens all that they think they know about the world, especially if you've wrapped yourself up in the I ams of your career. I am an accountant. I am a therapist. Like, well, as soon as you say that, it sounds like that's all you are. And it leaves no room to be anything else. Brandon? I love that. You should say that.
Sorry, struggling with the mute button again. I keep hitting it, nothing happens. But no,
Womp womp.
I'd say kind of addiction. Yep. But my go-to is, what would it look like if? And it's pretty much the same thing as I wonder, but that usually gets a good response as well.
My clinical director, Jesse Lott, frequently says, what are we not talking about? So you can be talking about a lot of stuff. He'll just go, what are we not talking about here? Is there anything that we're not covering? And usually that's an invitation for the person to go, well, yeah, okay, I've been keeping this thing from you.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? Where you open up, and sometimes there's no, I mean, quite often, frankly, I don't know where the person's going to go. But it's that simple question, and all of a sudden the person takes the license that, of course, they've had the entire time with that prompt to kind of, and either they know it's it's right there underneath the surface, or just as good, I mean, frankly, just as good, there's a pause, and then thought happens. I didn't even know if I would bring this up. I didn't even know if this was really a thing. But, and then typically, if there's already some rapport there, typically we drop into some stuff that can be really meaningful. And yeah, what a great way of I mean, for the therapist, I mean, for those listening out there, for the therapist, what a great way of sounding intelligent and just asking a really intelligent question. It doesn't mean that I know anything about what's going on next, but I'm being willing to drop that back to you. And so, a good beard and a simple question can make me look a whole lot smarter than I actually am. And it brings it back to the important part. What's going on for you?
I thought Mike was leaning in. I'm sorry. So we're getting a little long here, and I want to make sure that we stay on point and honor everybody's time. But if there's no more questions in the chat, I think I want to wrap up by offering that that I want to go back to the beginning where we started, which is the idea that the study of the human soul, psychology, is something that is deeper and greater and bigger than anything we'll ever come across. It's more powerful. It's more significant than any object, anything thing of value of this earth because it is so rich and precious, and every person has one. This is why I think it's really just like the idea of yield theory itself is so powerful, because you see through the outward behaviors of a human being and into their soul on the inside. Who are they as God sees them with God's eyes? That can really move a relationship in a really powerful direction. Now, not everybody's ready for it, especially if they've had a pattern of behavior over time that's, built into avoidance. What are they avoiding? Usually intimacy, looking at themselves. So you don't want to hit them with it right away, but that compassion really resonates, and it usually builds really good rapport. Authenticity, transparency, consistency. I've been really striving for those for several years in my own life. And in so doing, I attempt to receive feedback from other people. So I would invite people to realize that they can embrace the whole entirety of who they are, for great and terrible, and do amazing things. But you got to get out of your own way. And the way you learn that you're in your own way is whenever you get defensive. Defensiveness is a surefire indicator that you're probably clinging to something you haven't yet examined fully and made your own. So if we want to, whip around the horn here and do some takeaways, that's probably a good place to stop, I would say. And one thing I'll add too, if you're interested in that guilt stuff, Ghost and CNT Designs, watch the emotional functioning videos, or go back and listen to the emotional functioning podcast that we did several weeks ago.
Yeah, I can start first. My takeaway is just kind of wondering where we're going to go from my marketing point of view, and knowing how social media is kind of targeting. Marketers want to get more engagement because that benefits the accounts for reach and all of that. So getting comment wars and all of those things helps the brand accounts. And then you couple that with the more people you engage with, that's the content that you get more of, which then solidifies the echo chamber. And then after hearing the conversation, that's not a great path to lead, but with everybody interacting on social media, that's a path a lot of people are going down, and in their unconscious mind, they don't even know about it.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that before Brandon goes, I think that it's important to just know that what's going on is powerful in I guess, inoculating yourself against it. Right? If you know what they're trying to do to you, you can rebut and say, "Oh, you're just pinging my ego. You're just trying to get me to bite. You're trying to get me to take a stand. You're trying to get me to buy a product, whatever it is." Be like, "Okay, if I'm doing this out of my true self, I can do it with intentionality and I'll be at peace. But if I'm doing it out of reflexiveness, it's probably not of authenticity." Great point, Kevin. Bren?
Yeah, no, first off, just as always, I thought this was a great presentation, Jake. And when I was in school, they spent a lot of time focusing on a lot of like the newer theories and the newer modalities. And we didn't really get a lot of, we got a little bit, but we didn't really go into like the unconscious. So this was really, really cool. I learned a lot from it. I think my biggest takeaway is the part of the conversation when you were talking about your friend, how he made that analogy about how, like if your son broke his leg, would you not be, like speeding to get to the hospital and stuff like that? So even though like there are those like, the darker side of us that, usually we try to ignore, that can also be useful. So I think that was my biggest takeaway.
Rad. MicroDB, I'm not going.
I'll hop in. The capability for darkness, the capability for great and good things, those are incredibly important for us to recognize. And I think that we tend, I'll just go with the kind of social media zeitgeist, to use a fun word, within our current, this is what we all think stuff. We think that we are really, really evolved, really, really smart, far smarter than previous generations, previous 100 years ago, which I pulled out a 1940s fourth grade primer, and I shudder to think how a fourth grade class, or even a freshman college class would have done going through that fourth grade primer. So for those who don't know, the primer is like their book. They would get one book or several, but it was basically the common knowledge of a fourth grader in the 1940s, the expected content for them. And, it's Latin, it's It's mathematics, so we're not simple. So
Cursive.
this sense, yeah, cursive. I mean, it was comprehensive. So the idea that we are such an elevated and evolved society is, well, it pads our ego. To be blunt, we have a great responsibility with all this access to information. There is no excuse, would be my first response. There's no excuse for us to not educate ourselves and to be aware of the great amount of stuff that's out there. Speaking of which, Abbott Hoffman's um, in the chat had mentioned, what about crisis actors psyops? And I'm going to kind of put that into this package of, if we recognize that when we're just kind of going about our days, we're just in our basic ego state, which is not a negative place to be in general operating function, just kicking it through, having some breakfast, doing our thing, scrolling through, checking the news for the day, which probably means scrolling social media. We need to quickly remember that we are susceptible to the whims of our echo chamber. And so my example for that in my own personal life was January 6th, a couple years back. I thought, what a good thing to go to the Capitol and to, kind of say, hey, this is weird. I want to be here and say that this stuff is important. But immediately then after, I thought, this seems like a setup. There's no way that I'm going to show up to this event because I'm expecting something to go weird at this thing. Everybody better be right on their behavior, because the possibility of this going sideways by those who had other intents seemed really, really high in my mind, that one person could turn the tide of the perception of this event, and then I would be tied to it. Now, the cause itself, I thought, this makes sense. People want to show up and say, we think things are important. We think that we have concerns. So that I got. So the one person psyop factor, I would say we constantly need to be paying attention to. And that doesn't mean that we don't go to rallies. It doesn't mean that we don't show up for things. It does mean that we need to be very quick to recognize when we're being pulled into something that we may not be aware of, or that we also can be party to that ourselves. And so that'd be my takeaway, is be willing to take a moment of pause. If something is not actually on fire, you probably don't need to run or act in that exact moment. That there's probably time to reflect.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that. I totally agree with that, especially in the context of this conversation with the topic and guns. Right? To me, that makes the most sense. I feel like as the 2A community, we haven't done a good job of really studying the people we disagree with the way they have with us, right? And I think it's super important to all the therapists on this panel today have nailed it at one time, talking about, get out of what you think, make yourself uncomfortable, let yourself be challenged, and I'll wrap it up by saying, come up with your own solutions. And if what's holding you back is what your echo chamber is, your popularity in your echo chamber on Instagram, get off Instagram. You know what I mean? Or duck in and duck out like I do. I think it's super important, but I love the conversation. I really, when we first started this conversation, I was like, this is such an important topic. I always struggle with, we're the Guns and Mental Health podcast, but this one definitely turned right into guns to me. Like we got there. So I'm happy about that. But that's my takeaway.
Mine is actually Brandon's go-to. I kind of forgot to ask that question in the last couple of years. Is what would it look like if? And I'm taking that away because I need to do that to myself. Like, what would it look like if? And I just happen to have a sticky note from my ops director on my speaker here. It says, "Find your peace. The rest will follow." Because I've been struggling with some stuff lately. But what would it look like if? and then ellipsis, right? So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Brandon. And I think the message that I want to leave everybody is not just that you're greater than you realize. You can also be given over to really bad things if you're not aware of them, and you can become a problem if you don't examine your introjected beliefs. So here's what I'm leaving you with. Examine your beliefs, examine your ideas, examine them thoroughly. It does not mean you have to abandon them, but you do have to question what you believe and why you believe it. If you return to it, then you probably are pretty secure in that. And then if anybody ever questions it, you're good because you've already done the work. So that's my invitation. Examine your beliefs. Doesn't mean you have to leave them behind, but please, please, please examine why you think what you think, how you act the way you act, all your interactions, your hobbies, your interests, your occupation. And if you come back to the beginning and you go, yeah, I'm pretty good with that, and for the following reasons, then you're probably pretty good with it. And that puts you in better charge of your life. So thank you guys for bearing with me there. It could get really deep and really and complex, but a book recommendation, if you want to learn more about this stuff, is Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. That's Jung. And also Joseph Campbell, Hero with 1,000 Faces. Those are two really good books, and anything by Carl Jung is good. But I would start with Man and His Symbols, and I would recommend picking up the hardback version. You can get it at a library if you want, or order it online. And the reason I recommend that is because it's larger, and the pictures are in color. And if you're looking at a book about symbolism, you want colorful pictures that are big, not the little tiny rinky-dink black and white one in the paperback. So that's all I got. Thanks, and on behalf of our Walk the Talk America family and all our supporters, we wish you all great mental wellness. Bye-bye.